All right, good morning and welcome to our Theology and Peace gathering. This is going to be an absolutely wonderful week.
Good to see you.
Just diving into all sorts of things. I am Wesley Dunbar. I refuse to be called the president of Theology and Peace. I have the Zoom account, so I gather a monthly meeting of those Theology and Peace board members, and we continue to forge ahead as Theology and Peace. The other board members, some of them are here, some can't make it due to other commitments and obligations. Theology and Peace, one of the things that dawns on me, we are not Cover, but we are closely related to Cover. We overlap with Cover all the time. Theology and Peace comes together with a simple conviction that Christian faith should make us less violent, not just more articulate about violence. It was back in 2007 that a group of theologians and pastors and activists and social workers, psychologists, various people from gathered around the work of scholar René Girard, and whose insights into rivalry and scapegoating and the mimetic nature of human desire offered just a whole new wide open revelation of a rereading the Christian gospel. Girard's work exposed the uncomfortable truth that violence is not an exception in human relationships, but an insidiously persistent pattern. And we believe that a more loving pattern is possible, a pattern of belonging and a pattern of courage and a pattern of deepening peace that makes hope contagious. But that peace takes practice, that takes some activity, that takes engagement in the world. So we've been having conferences and conversations. Currently, some of our conversations are a quarterly speaker series, which we've had some wonderful people present there. We have some fun with Mimesis at the Movies. First Thursday of the month. If it's not taken up with something else, it's see a movie and let's talk mimesis or mimetic theory. That's a whole lot of fun now. But Wolfgang has a lot to say today, and I know you'd rather hear him than anything I've got to say. And then our friend and our colleague Paul Nectarline is going to do an introduction to Wolfgang. And I'm just so excited about this week. So Paul, come up here and at least say a few words, but let's have Wolfgang say most of them.
Yeah. I'll try not to take too long, but Wolfgang and I do go back 31 years, right? First met here in Chicago at the Cover Conference in 1995. So, and he and his Innsbruck colleagues were the first ones to tell me what my name means. So that was a big memory, but just a wonderful collaboration through the years, through all the Innsbruck folks. So I'm very pleased to have the responsibility of introducing them. They've written it out for me. So Christian peace ethics has shifted in recent decades from just war to just peace, where the just war tradition asked, how can we restrict war to morally justified instances? The just peace tradition asks, how can we create the conditions for peace and justice? The criteria of the just war tradition are still valid, but the center of peace ethics now focuses on peace and not on war. At the center of the concept of just peace is active nonviolence. Christians have learned from Gandhi that the Sermon on the Mount focuses not on the non-resistance, but on active nonviolence. In a final part of his presentation, Palaver will address what just peace means for the relationship between church and state by referring to Dietrich Bonhoeffer's interpretation of the catacomb, or restrainer, mentioned in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 6. Just a little bit more about Wolfgang. He is professor Emeritus of Catholic Social Thought at the University of Innsbruck, Austria, where he taught from 2002 until 2023, and where he was also Dean of the Catholic Theological Faculty from 2013 until 2017. He's an expert on the relationship between violence and religion and on Christian peace ethics. He is president of Pax Christi, Austria, since 2019 and became, in March 2025, personal representative of the OSCE Chairperson-in-Office on combating racism, xenophobia, and discrimination, also focusing on intolerance and discrimination against Christians and members of other religions. So please join me in welcoming Wolfgang Palaver.
So thank you very much for inviting me to Theology and Peace. Thank you also for the nice introduction by my friend Paul Nüchterlein. I'm happy to talk about a topic that's very dear to my heart, and it's actually based on a German book, and I circle it around. Maybe there are German speakers among us, or one speaker at least, who can take a closer look.
Is it going to be translated?
It has been translated into Spanish, and if anyone would offer me some help, maybe also in English, but not now. Yeah. So I will do it as Paul already told us, go forward in 3 steps. I will explain what it means to emphasize active nonviolence, and I think it's very important to emphasize and stress the term active in this regard. And then I will more or less explore the most recent development of peace ethics in the Catholic tradition, although I think, at least in the German-speaking world, that's also very close what the Protestant Church in Germany, for instance, says about these issues. And I will show that active nonviolence became more and more central to the peace ethics, and also goes together with multilateralism, and I explained that a little bit, and that's also very close to my recent work in the framework of the OSCE. And then there is a final and most likely challenging part for you, why the church and political forces of order have different tasks. And that's also very dear to my heart. This third point might be a challenge, but please try to listen, and then I try in the discussion and the Q&A how it should not be misunderstood and how it could be understood. So what does it mean to emphasize active nonviolence? If you look at the Catholic tradition after the Constantinian shift, the Catholic tradition said more or less the Sermon on the Mount is something for specialists, for clerics or monks, and ordinary Christians must obey the commandments only. That's enough for them. They should not worry themselves with the Sermon on the Mount. Now in the Protestant tradition, as soon as the Bible became available in all the vernacular languages and people started to read the Bible in its full, what the Catholic Church did not allow for ordinary Christians before, they discovered, of course, the Sermon on the Mount, but also most of those people coming from the Reformation, like the Anabaptists or the Mennonites, they took again, they read the Sermon on the Mount in a too literal sense, so they missed in some way the core of this message, because they just understood the Sermon on the Mount means non-resistance. And I have an interesting example from the Anabaptist tradition. It's from the Martyr's Mirror, this famous book of the Anabaptists. And there is one striking example about a Dutch Anabaptist called Dirk Williams, who was in prison. And he was able to free himself from the prison and flee from the prison. And it was in the Netherlands when the bonds were still frozen. So he escaped, and he was seen, of course, after a long time in prison. He was not very thick, and so he was able to flee over the frozen bond. But the thief catcher who was behind him was a well-fed warden, and he broke into the ice, and Dirk Williams turned around, helped him, and so saved the life of his pursuer. And the pursuer, of course, said, "Let Dirk Williams go," but the others who watched the whole scene catched Dirk Williams again, and he was burned at the stake in 1569. So it's an example of non-resistance, not really an example already of active nonviolence. And today, that's also interesting, in the Mennonite tradition, and maybe there are Mennonites among us here, are there? Not yet. They know better. But in the Mennonite tradition, it's also interesting that they moved in the last couple of years more from this position of passive non-resistance towards a much more politically oriented, active nonviolence. And I think the Christians today learned a lot about the emphasis on active nonviolence from Mahatma Gandhi. And I will introduce you a little bit to Gandhi's view, a view that conquered over the decades Christians in their self-understanding. So Christians often understood nonviolence as nothing but passive renunciation, and maybe therefore politically almost irrelevant. Gandhi, however, when he read the Sermon on the Mount, emphasized Jesus' activity. So two quotes from Gandhi. "As I read the New Testament for the first time, I detected no passivity, no weakness about Jesus as depicted in the four Gospels. Jesus Christ indeed has been acclaimed as the Prince of passive resistors, but I submit in that case passive resistance must mean satyagraha, and satyagraha alone." Satyagraha is this artificial Indian word that Gandhi created in South Africa when he moved away from passive resistance towards active nonviolence, meaning holding fast to truth, soul force, truth force, love force. So the term force is very interesting in his English translations of satyagraha. And we can quickly go to the Christian take-up of Gandhi's insight. So satyagraha, truth force, love force, was even translated with the term, with the expression militant nonviolence by Martin Luther King. So he emphasized really the forceful part, the active part of nonviolence. And a crucial person, and I think most of you are familiar with the work of Walter Wink, who actually was at the Cover Conference with us in Toronto in 2006. It was a great experience to be with him. But he already in the early 80s, and interestingly, and that bridges a little bit between Gandhi and Mandela, he was smuggled into South Africa in the 1980s, and there gave a seminar on Jesus' third way, the relevance of nonviolence in South Africa today, and it has been republished with the title Jesus' Third Way later, as you are familiar. So let's go back to Gandhi first. Gandhi wrote, "My creed of nonviolence is an extremely active force. It has no room for cowardice or even weakness. There is hope for a violent man to be someday non-violent, but there is none for a coward. So the problem with a too literal and too superficial reading of the Sermon on the Mount is especially the verse 39 in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew, where it is said, do not resist evil. Do not resist evil in this wording is a problematic understanding because it would lead us to non-resistance. It would not lead us to active non-violence. And it was Gandhi who understood it in an active way, and it was especially Walter Wink, but also other biblical scholars who took it up in a much more active way. So today Walter Wink rightly says it should be translated, do not violently resist evil. So it's not resisting evil, so it's not non-resistance, but it is a third way. It's neither passivity, so let have evil its way, that's wrong. It's also not violent opposition because, and we know it from Girard's theory, to oppose violence with the same means is the danger of mirroring the oppressor, and we get into an escalation of violence. Jesus stands for a third way, and this third way is also the way of Gandhi and Walter Wink and active nonviolence. A third way, neither passivity nor violent opposition, but fighting with non-violent means. And if you read Matthew 5:39 in full, you will come to the most challenging passage where it is said we should turn the other cheek. And you probably know the interpretation of Walter Wink, or who does not know it? Who does not know it? Okay, would you be willing to do a little experiment with me, please? It's not difficult, and it's good that you are a lady, so you will do it smoothly. I ask you to turn to strike me on my right cheek. Yeah, not hard, but that's not my right cheek. And this is your left hand. This is your left hand, and the left hand in the times of Jesus, even today, is for cleaning operations. It's not for fighting. So you have to use the right hand and my right cheek. And that's the right thing. And what is this kind of gesture if you do it with the backhand? Is it a fight between equals? It's a dismissive gesture. Thank you very much. Experiment fully. Actually, I learned that from Walter Wink, and it's really right. Walter Wink told us you have to do that physically, because otherwise we don't get the thing. Because I present my book today, I think 37th time, and I always do this experiment. And it's always the same. The first you take your right hand and slap the other guy on the left cheek. But Jesus is not talking about the left cheek. He's talking about the right cheek, and here right and left is very important. So Jesus talks about the situation when, for instance, Roman oppressor strikes a Jew in the time of Jesus, and this is a dismissive gesture. And to say if someone strikes you in this dismissive way with the backhand on your right cheek, you insist on your dignity, and let not happen this, but you say if you want to strike me as a real fighter would strike me. So you insist, that's the message of Jesus in this part, you insist on your dignity, and you resist to take your dignity away. So, and that's very important, because one of the most important and politically influential interpretations of this passage in the Sermon on the Mount comes from Max Weber, already in his speech Politics as a Vocation in 1919, where he says, the Sermon on the Mount expresses an ethic of indignity. And this is completely wrong, but it conquered, so to say, the world. And we should not only blame Weber, because I think Weber came to this conclusion because most of the Christians themselves interpreted in the wrong way. So that was the usual interpretation. And today, more and more Christians understand, although it's still striking for me. I said I presented my book 37 times, and it's striking that among Christian communities, and most of my audiences were Christians, they still have this old way of reading the Sermon on the Mount in their mind, and that's part of the problem, and we have to work. I mean, Walter Wink started in the early 80s, and now it's 40 years, more than even 50 years after Wink started, and it's still not conquered the Christian mind. It's important also to look at the Bible, at the New Testament as a whole, because we know that in the Gospel of John, Jesus was smitten in his face by a servant when he was at court, and he didn't turn the other cheek. He again insisted on his dignity and asked the guy who striked him, why have you striked me? Have you a reason for that, or are you just a bully? So it's again, you see, at the center, it is the insistence on your dignity. The German bishops, the Catholic bishops of Germany, published a peace letter in 2024, and they said correctly, and referring to the Gospel of John, Jesus definitely did not meet with his accusers and torturers by treading softly. So Jesus did not meet with his accusers and torturers by treading softly. And you see also in the picture how we should understood this passage. Now a short, for those who are Girardians, a short summary of this first section of my lecture. How does Gandhi's active nonviolence relate to Girard's mimetic theory? First of all, Gandhi, and I will also introduce you to Mandela and Girard, all of them understood the contagious nature of violence with its tendency to escalate. Gandhi, one example from the writings of Gandhi, in the year before he was killed, when there was a huge uprise of violence between Hindus and Muslims due to the separation of the Indian contingent, Gandhi wrote the following: once the evil spirit of violence is unleashed, by its inherent nature, it cannot be checked or even kept within any prescribed limits. I mean, you can take this quote and it matches completely Girard's book, Battling to the End, where he engages with the theory of war of Karl von Clausewitz. And the other side is, I have to admit, I was for 40 years and still am a follower of Girard's mimetic theory, and some of the reviewers of my book on mimetic theory said, well, one thing is lacking in Palaver's book, there is no criticism of Girard's mimetic theory. And when I published the book in 2003, I had no criticism. Today, because of a research project where I engaged with mimetic theory and Gandhi, I have a little criticism. Girard was never strong on what it means politically, socially, to draw the conclusion of the biblical message on peace and nonviolence. And just 3 years ago, we found a new letter of Father Schwager, my mentor in Innsbruck, to Girard that is not published in the collection of the letters. So hopefully soon there will be, we found 3 more letters from Girard, from Schwager to Girard, and one is really striking for our topic of today. It's from 1983, and the movie Gandhi was released in Austria in Easter time 83, and Schwager went to the movie and watched the movie, and a few days later he wrote a letter to Girard, and in this letter he writes the following: "The film about Gandhi impressed me greatly. In a certain way, his spiritual and political strategy is the complement of your own thought. It opens a third path between a passive, doloristic attitude that accepts suffering in a resigned or even masochistic manner, and an active attitude that easily slips into aggression." So indirectly, also Schwager here discovers the third way of Jesus, or the third way of Gandhi. And I would today say that Gandhi's concept of active nonviolence is complementing the anthropology of Girard's mimetic theory. Even if you go to Girard's writings, he sometimes mixes up, when he talks about the Sermon on the Mount, the left cheek or the right cheek. So this difference doesn't matter for Girard, because he was more in a mood of renunciation, still more in the non-resistance part of this tradition of the active part. And I think we can really complement. So Gandhi shows us how politically, socially, the Sermon on the Mount and the New Testament can help us to come to a better understanding of peace. Most likely all of you, or most of you, are familiar with this seminal book of Erika Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, Why Civil Resistance Works, an empirical study that investigated 312 cases of resistance between the years 1940 and 2006, and comes to the conclusion that nonviolent resistance methods have been more than twice as effective in achieving limited and full success among anti-regime campaigns. An example is, for instance, the toppling of the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, also the end of the Cold War, the so-called Velvet Revolution, and other examples. And there are also examples of violent resistance. This study doesn't say that all the time every type of nonviolent resistance is more efficient and sustainable, but in average one can say that nonviolent resistance is twice as effective and sustainable compared to violent forms. Of course, we have to understand most of the examples are taken from resistance inside the society. It's more difficult to work with this concept in conflicts between states, as we have, for instance, in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And in order to investigate what it means for legitimate defense, the concept of nonviolence, we would have to talk about civilian-based defense, but I cannot go now deeper into that question, but in the discussion I can say a little bit more if you want. So what can we learn from Gandhi? Nonviolence is not a recipe for all cases. In a sudden act of aggression, nonviolent means may not be available, and Gandhi was quite aware of that. Gandhi, for instance, called the military defense of Poland against the overwhelming military power of Nazi Germany, he used the term, this was almost nonviolent. And this term, almost nonviolent, which of course is in big tension with a black and white understanding of violence and nonviolence, is very significant for the pragmatic approach of Gandhi. And the pragmatic approach of Gandhi is often overlooked in the Western world, where Gandhi is turned into an absolute pacifist, that he wasn't. And he even uses the term almost nonviolent also for cases when women defend themselves against a rapist with all their means. And Gandhi wrote, even if they use a dagger, it's almost nonviolent. So it's very important, if you try to understand Gandhi, that Gandhi had a gradual understanding of nonviolence and a gradual understanding of violence. He says there are degrees of violence and there are degrees of nonviolence, and we have to try to shift as strongly as possible towards the nonviolent side without falling into the black and white concept that doesn't really help us at all. Nonviolence is a long-term concept that needs preparation of a whole society if possible, and if the preparation has not been done, you cannot count on it in that sense. And nonviolence, active nonviolence, has to be compared to an urgent surgery with the long-term effort to prevent sickness. So nonviolence is a long-term strategy. If you want to have nonviolent means available in 20 years, you have to start to prepare yourself for the society today. And then I will read to you the most striking quote I found in the work of Gandhi, and that was when I was reflecting on the war of aggression against Ukraine with a Gandhian lens. And I found the following quote, and I will try to show you how you can derive three conclusions from this quote. So I read it to you and then I draw the conclusions. It's from December 1939. My nonviolence does recognize different species of violence, defensive and offensive. It is true that in the long run, the difference is obliterated, but the initial merit persists. A nonviolent person is bound, when the occasion arises, to say which side is just. Thus, I wished success to the Abyssinians, the Spaniards, the Czechs, the Chinese, and the Poles, though in each case I wished that they could have offered nonviolent resistance. So the three conclusions that I draw from this quote: first of all, we have to distinguish between the violence of the defense and the violence of the offensive part. So I use it, for instance, in view of the war of aggression against Ukraine. It's not the same what Russia does and what Ukraine does. And sometimes at least in the Austrian and German peace movement, I come across people who about 2 weeks after the war broke out in 2022, they wrote a letter to the Ukrainian embassy and the Russian embassy with the same content. So they should stop, both should stop. And this is not following this important distinction between the violence of an aggressor and the violence of the defensive forces. The second thing, and the second insight of Gandhi is again very close to Girard's mimetic theory, that the longer you fight militarily against an oppressor, the higher and the temptation is growing that you will mirror the aggressor. The longer the conflict goes, the more you are probably drawn into a mimetic mirroring of violence, and we know a lot of examples where that happens. And the third insight is that Gandhi said, wherever it's possible, that's the last part of this quote, you should try to prefer non-violence over violent resistance. So the second author I'm dealing with in my book is Nelson Mandela. It will be a shorter insight, but also important insights that we can gain. Like Gandhi and Girard, he was aware of the dangerous escalation of violence. Wherever possible, less violence is preferable. He was a was very strongly committed to the Freedom Charter in South Africa of 1995, Charter of the Civil Society at that time, that he rejected throughout his time terror against white civilians because they are white. So that's a different, I mean, Mandela created and founded the military wing of the African National Congress, but he never fought against whites because they are white, whereas there were other militant groups in South Africa who did that. So that's an important difference if you compare the Mandela's ANC with Hamas. He was also had a very important intervention when his possible successor, very popular young follower of Mandela, Chris Hani, was killed by right-wing extremists in 1993 in order to derail the process towards a free and democratic South Africa. So they shot him with the hope that there will be a civil war breaking out and that the whole process towards a free and democratic South Africa will derail. And at that time, Mandela was already free from prison. De Klerk, the president who was unable to solve this problem, asked Mandela to step in, and they created a week of resistance, demonstration and discussions in order to channel the anger of the black people in South Africa and avoiding therefore the breakout of a civil war that would have derailed the whole process. So that was a very important example of political leadership. And after the end of apartheid, he established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and this concept was based on the insight that forgiveness takes precedence over retaliation. So that means crimes throughout the time of apartheid should be addressed. The truth of the victims has to be faced and have to be put up on the table, but that doesn't mean that it should lead to retaliation, but wherever it's possible, forgiveness has to be preferred. And that was, Charles Taylor told us that in his writings, that was a really very important ethical step forward. How should we engage and deal with crimes of the past, war crimes of the past, torture, oppression in the past? We cannot, and that is part of the biblical legacy of the truth of the victim. We cannot forget it, but nothing forces us to engage mimetically by taking retaliation instead of forgiveness. And I mean, this was a very important lesson that Nelson Mandela, South Africa, gave the whole world, and in other countries it was repeated and introduced and applied. But we cannot be sure that it will stay that way, and I was a little bit shocked when the United States, and most likely influenced by Putin's Russia, presented to us last fall the 28-point Ukraine plan that fortunately was quickly dismissed. But if you read the number 26 of this 28-point Ukraine plan, it goes as following. All parties involved in this conflict will receive full amnesty for their actions during the war and agree not to make any claims or consider any complaints in the future. So that means we stay silent, whatever happens. We don't talk about the Bucha massacre. Other war crimes are just forgotten, and we move forward. So that is an example that what Mandela's legacy left us has been already forgotten, at least in some countries, or I don't blame a whole country upon some leaders of countries.
Yep.
So I come, and it will be quicker, to my second point, from just war to just peace. So the peace ethics of the mainline churches, at least in Europe, but also in the Catholic tradition, moved from just war to just peace. And if you have read or taken a look to the most recent encyclical of Pope Leo, Magnifica Humanitas, you will read in the number 192 that just war is outdated. So the preferential option for nonviolence gets into the center of peace ethics, and it's not surprising that the Pope Leo also challenged and criticized the normalization of war that's going on right now. Just peace means an emphasis on positive peace, a peace that includes social justice, because peace without justice is nothing we should prefer. It demands the fight. It demands fighting the roots of violence. It's a long-term perspective that tries to prevent war from the very beginning. Active nonviolence is also not a passive non-resistance. It means an active fight against discrimination and oppression. And what's also important and close to my engagement in the OSCE, we need a strengthening of multilateralism. And I was recently in contact with Antonio Spadaro, a former journalist and editor-in-chief of the Jesuit magazine journal Civiltà Cattolica, who has was always read as a signpost what's going on in the Vatican. Spadaro, as a journalist, joined Pope Francis on 63 visits to foreign countries, so he got a very good insight into the diplomacy of the Pope and the Vatican, and he just published an English book by Notre Dame Press on this diplomacy that's also very interesting. And in this book you can find an insight that he says Pope Francis had two lenses to look in the world. One was the chessboard, meaning force is stronger than right, might trumps over right. So who has the cards dominates. And the alternative positive lens is the fabric. That's diplomacy, that is multilateralism, that is wherever people form networks and engage with each other. If we translate these two terms, fabric and chessboard, into political terms, we could say the fabric stands for the spirit of Helsinki, the final act of Helsinki in 1975, and the chessboard is close to Yalta when Khrushchev, Stalin, and Roosevelt divided up the world at the end of the Second World War. Pope Leo is very strongly engaged in supporting multilateralism. Again, in the recent encyclica, you find a chapter, The Crisis of Multilateralism, and another chapter, The Necessity of Diplomacy and Multilateralism. And I will show you a little bit what this concretely means. So first, active nonviolence. In 2017, Pope Francis published for the World Day of Peace the message Nonviolence, a Style for Politics for Peace, where he says, and you see that also in the Vatican now, the active dimension of nonviolence is very well understood. Nonviolence is sometimes taken to mean surrender, lack of involvement, and passivity, but this is not the case, and the Pope refers to Gandhi, to Martin Luther King, to the Muslim Gandhi, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and Lema Gobwe, a leader among women who stopped the civil war in Liberia, also by using sex strike to bring the men to reason in some way. Nonviolence has to be implied, according to Pope Francis, on all levels of life and politics. And then there is also a very interesting passage in this peace message where he says, peace building through active nonviolence is the natural and necessary complement to the Church's continuing efforts to limit the use of force by the application of moral norms. So the criteria of just war tradition are still important, and they were used recently by Pope Leo when he criticized the US and Israeli engagement in Iran, or the US military attack in Venezuela, that they were not following those criteria without going back to the just war tradition as a concept. So just to tell you now on multilateralism, here I have a new picture of Walter 2.0. That's the chessboard, and then you have another picture of how we people by working together can save the creation. And I underline it a little bit with what the recent popes said on multilateralism. So Pope Francis advocated the spirit of Helsinki when he flew back from Kazakhstan in 2022. We need leaders who, on the international level, can enable peoples to grow in mutual understanding and dialogue, and thus give birth to a new spirit of Helsinki, the determination to strengthen multilateralism, to build a more stable and peaceful world with an eye to future generations. For this to happen, what is needed is understanding, patience, and dialogue with all. And it was a little bit surprising in a very positive sense when this year Pope Leo, on the 9th of January, when the diplomats accredited at the Vatican were assembled, and he gave a speech. And this speech was, of course, reacting indirectly also to Venezuela and recent political developments. And Pope Leo expressed his strengthening of multilateralism as a place for dialogue and diplomacy in a very clear way, so without wavering at all. In our time, the weakness of multilateralism is a particular cause for concern at the international level. A diplomacy that promotes dialogue and seeks consensus among all parties is being replaced by a diplomacy based on force by either individuals or groups of allies. War is back in vogue, and the zeal for war is spreading. The principle established after the Second World War, which prohibited nations from using force to violate the borders of others, has been completely undermined. A clear expression of multilateralism, a support of the United Nations Charter, and what the people understood after the Second World War, where we have to go forward. And it seems, maybe because 1945 is already decades ago, that people have forgotten what is at stake in a highly technologically advanced world of today. So I come to my final point, which is a shorter one, but maybe challenging point. When I wrote my book in 23, I had a very good editor, and she helped me to clarify some points. When she came across the passage where I used the restrainer, the catechon of the second letter to the Thessalonians, to engage with peace ethics, she said, that's very complicated, and how the people will understand it. I rewrote parts of it to make it more clearer. I tried to explain it to you today, so it may be challenging, it may be provoking, but we can discuss this. So the question is why the church and political forces of order have different tasks. And I engaged with Dietrich Bonhoeffer's interpretation of the restrainer, the so-called catechon, in the second letter to the Thessalonians. And you know, besides my lectures and panel discussion contributions on peace ethics, I was in the last 12 months very much engaged in discussions about Peter Thiel's Antichrist lectures. I prefer to talk about peace, but I have to talk about the Antichrist also, and Thiel's Antichrist lectures made also strong references to the catechon, so suddenly this term became a popular term in the media, discussions started, and sometimes, and that's a little bit too easy, the restrainer became very prominent in the 20th century by the state law scholar Carl Schmitt, who was partly very strongly aligned with the Nazi party in Germany. So it's a little bit too quickly to say Kat Echon Nazi and then refer to all the right-wing examples we have today in our world to dismiss this concept at all. And there are some things we have to be cautious in interpreting these things. So I got already very excited when most, especially in the United States, theologians or people who use those concepts talk about the Katechon of St. Paul. I'm quite convinced with a lot of biblical scholars, the second letter to the Thessalonians was not written by Paul, but by a scholar about 30 years later. So that's first important. The second important thing is that Carl Schmitt really made the Katechon this restrainer who holds back the second coming of Christ, but also suppresses violence. For Carl Schmitt, this was nearly a holy, a saintly figure that Carl Schmitt wrote in his diaries, I believe in the Katechon. But Bonhoeffer was much clearer, because the Katechon holds up the outbreak of the chaos of violence. He holds up the domination of the Antichrist, but he also prevents the second coming of Christ. So it's a very ambivalent figure if you think that the early church was urging for the second coming of Christ. So Bonhoeffer, much clearer and theological, much better than Carl Schmitt said, the Katechon is not God. That's not a saintly concept, a saintly figure. It's not without guilt, but God uses it to protect the world from disintegration. It's, if you say it in a very sloppy way, it's God's plan B with people who do not go along the message of the kingdom. The church is different from the Katechon. The church stands for the miracle of a new awakening of faith. Her task is to bear witness to Jesus Christ as living Lord. So the church or the churches are requested to show what it means to live according to the rules of the kingdom, and has therefore a different task than forces of political order, so a different task than the Katechon. But that means, according to Bonhoeffer, not a radical separation, but a cooperation by preserving its difference and yet joining in sincere alliance with those powers. The church forces the custodians of power, in particular, to listen and change their way. So the insight of Bonhoeffer is, the more the churches live the spirit of the Sermon on the Mount and give a good example, the more they can influence as part of the civil society the culture of a country, and therefore can influence indirectly the way how politics and forces of political order will develop. So it's a bottom-up approach, so to say, and it's an approach how from the pre-political level you can influence the political level. So if the culture is not really giving a good example of nonviolence, you should not be surprised that politics follows the pattern of the chessboard. And what Bonhoeffer understood, and today also peace ethics scholars like Gerhard Schlabach, is that of course churches also benefit from the violent forces of order. So we have police, we have prisons, we have a lot of things which are of course from a Girardian perspective tainted by violence, but we could not claim a higher moral ground. We have nothing to do with those forces of violent order, but there has to be a very good tension. So the church has to give a good example, and without dismissing in a hypocritical way the forces of order. In 2000, the Catholic Bishop of Germany published a peace letter with a 30-40 pages biblical part of this peace letter. And this biblical part is one of the best biblical approaches to the broader question of peace in our world of today, still valid today, 26 years after it was published. And from a Girardian perspective, if you read this biblical part of this peace letter of 2000, you will realize it's deeply influenced by a Girardian perspective. Girard is not mentioned, Raimund Schwag is not mentioned, but the key author of this biblical part was Norbert Lofing, an Old Testament scholar who was deeply influenced by Girard and Schwager, and wrote a marvelous piece by especially focusing on the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, not so much on the New Testament, and saying if you study the Old Testament, you will discover two concepts of peace. You will find a peace that still uses violence to suppress violence, and you will see a messianic peace which goes beyond violence. And we have to reflect on the relationship of these two concepts of peace. And what I'm telling now is just another example of what I tried to explain to you with the help of Bonhoeffer. So this peace letter says, Christians must accept institutions for the containment of violence, but are obligated to promote the vision they are privileged to share by abjuring violence and furthering justice and reconciliation wherever and whenever they can. So Christians must accept in some way catechontic forces, but have to go beyond these catechontic patterns by exemplifying a greater messianic peace. So that's the challenge and the task what churches have to do. And now I summarize my last point with a little bit provoking pictures, and maybe you disagree with my pictures, but it helped me to understand what I just explained in a more systematic way. Last year on the 1st of August, because of the final act of the Helsinki process, there was the 50+ conference in Helsinki of the OSCE, and I was able to be there. And the day after the conference, I spent one day in Helsinki, and one of the diplomats, or the Finnish diplomat, said I should visit a little island outside of Helsinki, which is a military fortress in the tradition. I mean, today it's a museum, but you still see military tools all over the place. And so that's what you see all over this island. So on the border of this island, you see big cannons, and that shows what Katechon looks like, at least at that time. But that was not the reason to show you the picture. My last slide gives you an insight about church and Katechon, because in the middle of this island there is a church, as you see in the right upper picture. There is a church, and the church is encircled by a fence, and the pillars of the fence are cannons. So in the middle of the church you have this chain around the church with cannons as the pillars of the chain, and I said that's a little bit strange, but it's not so far away from our reality. But the main reason why I thought it matches what Bonhoeffer understood and what the German peace letter of 2000 shows us, in the middle of this, inside this fenced space is the church. And if you look at the top of the church functions until today as a lightning house for the Helsinki harbor. So the lightning tower of the church goes beyond the military defense, and I think that's the task of the churches today. Although we also are protected by catechontic forces of order, our task is to give a lightning example to the world what a messianic peace could look like. Thank you very much for your attention. break now, or do we have a Q&A?
We'll just go on
Take
break.
10 minutes, there's still food outside,
Yeah.
and then we can come back and have
Yeah,
Q&A.
that's a good idea. Yes, please.
So I have a question. I'm a pastor at a local church, and I'm curious, like, practically, this difference between the church and the political forces, how do you see local churches, like, living into that kind of the role? And also, I think you mentioned something about the role of the church to support grassroots, maybe. I think you were going to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So your question is about what is the distinction between the task of forces of political order and the churches mean locally?
Right. What does that look like for
Yeah.
a local? Yeah.
I mean, first of all, what I tried to explain is, of course, on a more general level. So I think it's important for Christians just to understand these two different tasks and to tell that also in local parishioners, maybe in a more accessible way. I think it's important just that they know what they are in. And the other thing is what I always find important, to distinguish between the political and the pre-political level. And the pre-political level is the grassroots level. It's the level of social culture in our society, and churches have a very important role to engage on this pre-political level. And only if the pre-political level is able to give us certain perspectives or show us in what direction we should develop or act, then the political level can adapt in some way. Because sometimes we forget, we criticize politicians from a Christian point of view for not going in the right direction, and forget they are elected by people who do not understand what is at stake. So that's a long-term perspective. So if you start to educate your parishioners in a certain perspective, hopefully in 10 years you will see better results in that sense. And how to do it, I mean, that's a little bit beyond my competence, but I think it's important also, as I said, I presented my book 37 times, especially on parish levels or local levels. And most of those people who were listening to me have never heard about what active nonviolence means, have never heard how a proper interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount looks like. So I think if we do not do that, then the people will indirectly just say to turn the other cheek is just politically nonsense, or even as Max Weber said it's ethics of indignity. What is it not, right? So I mean, I observe the turning the other cheek, how this metaphor is used in media and politics. So when Donald Trump was addressing taxes against Canada, the media said Canada will not turn the other cheek. So that means you still see on a media level or everyday level, these metaphors, these insights are misunderstood. So I think the first task as a pastor on a local level is to get to a proper understanding of those things. And there I think is still a lot to do.
I think I might have a follow-up. A friend of mine, Paul K. Chappelle, he was an Iraq War veteran, but then after his service, he got training in nonviolence. He was saying that the military, like, they spend so much money training people, and they get very intense training. And his idea was that we needed to do the exact same thing on the level of peace, and we're not doing that. Like, today, this is, for my soul today, this is wonderful, but then I need that long-term training and practice, and that, so he's developed a thing called peace literacy, as kind of teaching that. But do you know of any other, like, long-term or, like, actual, like, training to do that. Like I know I've done Pace Bene, and like one of the things that I got from them, which some of my friends here are tired of hearing it, is the two hands of nonviolence. I'm going to say no to the evil, and I'm not going to give up on your humanity. So can you direct me towards?
I mean, on a very practical level, I cannot tell you a lot, but if I understand your question properly, you are asking the question, don't we need also a lot of training in regard to nonviolence, and I fully agree with that. There, I just use the word civilian-based defense briefly, and that's the European discussion that people in the peace movement tries to support, because this concept, Gene Sharp was one of the people who developed, based on Gandhi, methods, and in his books he had, I think, more than 100 or even 200, I don't know now exact number, of methods of civilian-based defense. The European Union about a year ago said that they will invest extra 800 billion euros for defense. And I often say, if we can use 50 billion for training in that direction, that would be very helpful. And there is a second thing, you know, Austria, for instance, has still the draft, but in Germany they suspended the draft after the end of the Cold War, and I think it was a proper thing, because from a church perspective, the draft is a highly problematic thing, because it militarizes more or less the whole of society. So the German churches were very much engaged in stopping the draft, but now the whole geopolitical development seems to force Germany to go back to the draft. And there is a very interesting philosopher of Humboldt University, Olaf Müller, who published a little book, Philosophical Defense of Pacifism, but he is not someone advocating absolute pacifism, but also in a pragmatic, relative sense, very close to what I presented to you. And he said, if the draft comes back in Austria, in Germany, we should give the young people in Germany the alternative either to join the Bundeswehr, the German army, or to develop a new wing of civilian-based defense with proper training, with institutional arrangements, so to say, to have a non-violent pillar of national defense in Germany. And if you think about and reflect about civilian-based defense, what does it mean? It means you are not defending borders and territory, but you defend the way of life. You defend how you engage in democracy, how social justice in your country is lived, how solidarity is lived, and to prepare people to defend. So if an occupying forces occupies territory, it still cannot occupy the country if people do not work together with them, do not obey the new rules. But not obeying new rules, that has to be, you have to prepare. You have to think what kind of channels of communication do we need, how can we support each other, because it's also demanding, it's demanding like military defense, but it's a different thing. So you have to prepare that, and I think it would be less costly to develop this wing. And the second thing is, what in the West and in Europe, it's very often forgotten. I mean, if you count just the tanks and the military devices we have today in Europe, we have more than the Russians. We spend more money for already right now, more money for military defense than the Russians do. I mean, the problem is the Western European countries are not aligned enough, so the systems are not really compatible completely. So we probably have to do something in that direction. And but if you invest just in military means, you will also, and that's the mimetic thing, you will also cause fear on the other side. So the other side will also say, well, they are now going forward militarily, we also have to do something, and you are again in an escalation. And we should not forget that worldwide in the last 11 years, the global military spending was rising for 11 years. And if you compare that or relate that to the doomsday clock, which since 1947 is now 85 seconds before midnight, was never as dangerous as today, you think humanity is completely out of mind to invest more and more in military means. So to develop a non-violent pillar of national defense in Germany would mean you strengthen the resilience of Germany, and if you strengthen resilience of Germany today, it already benefits the society today, and it's not so much threatening for a possible occupier than if you go into the military, in the military direction. Just one more sentence, and Olaf Müller says he estimates if Germany opens this second wing, maybe about half of the young people would choose this. And this alternative service would not mean to help elderly people, as in some countries done. It's really as a non-violent wing of defense.
Thank you.
Okay, I maybe on and then.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk, Wolfgang. It was refreshing, and I wasn't, as a Lutheran, wasn't too troubled by your last section, which was reminiscent of a good interpretation of the two kingdoms notion within Luther.
Yeah, I hope that the Lutherans will understand.
Yeah, Bonhoeffer, right, there he is. Regarding practical training for peace, during the Civil Rights Movement, it was the Fellowship of Reconciliation that really did the work, and they're still doing the work out there of gathering people together on the grassroots to learn how to be active in nonviolence. One of the things I've been mulling over lately, and I'm using in a talk I'm giving next week in Minneapolis, is William James' 1910 essay on the moral equivalent of war. Now, the way he applied it was a war against nature, which we can look at as both sort of tragic and prophetic at the same time, right? Because that's in fact what's happened. But the notion that we need kind of disciplined, honorable, strenuous engagement on behalf of peace that reflects or can compete with, in a good sense, what the military is doing, it seems to me to make an awful lot of sense. And we've tried that here in the U.S. That was the notion behind the Peace Corps. It was the notion behind the U.S. Institute of Peace. And it was behind what USAID was trying to do. They are all being dismantled by Elon Musk and Doge and the current administration. So my question to you is, in light of that kind of Christian nationalism, is multilateralism enough? In other words, is multilateralism coherent enough to give us the kind of positive mimetic energy to resist this nationalism?
Yeah, so your question is multilateralism enough?
Yeah.
And it's not not enough.
Mm-hmm.
But I think on the top level and the global level, it's very important, and it only functions in the long run if it is supported from bottom up by a culture. And you can say in some way, if you have a critical view of the development and the situation of the United Nations, that it never really worked fully. And maybe it will still take a long time until that goes. That brings me to a very interesting interview with Hannah Arendt, who, the German version of On Violence, the book On Violence, in the German version, there is an interview with Adelbert Reif, and it was in German, but it was later published in one of the early issues of the New York Review of Books. And in this interview, she summarizes one of her key insights, that she was very critical of the term sovereignty. And she said, as long as people and states don't give up this term, the United Nations will either turn towards an imperial totalitarian world state where you have no foreign country to go if you are in trouble, or it will not function. And in some way you can say that happened, so that means we have to go back and rethink sovereignty. So she understood on the personal level to think, and the libertarian ideology is completely committed to this view that human beings are completely autonomous and sovereign as an individual. And that's of course wrong, and we learn it from Girard and many others, that we human beings cannot live without other human beings, so we have to give up sovereignty on the personal, individual level, but we also have to criticize sovereignty on the political level. And the problem is that today the term sovereignty is on the rise. So there are certain movements that are strongly supporting sovereignty, and we have to be critical of it. A key Catholic thinker who was working for a quite long time also in the United States in Princeton was Jacques Maritain. And Jacques Maritain, after the Second World War, said we should get rid of the term sovereignty in the political sphere. And I think that was a deep insight. Both Hannah Arendt and Jacques Maritain understood that sovereignty has a warlike dimension going along with it, and we should be aware. The more you emphasize sovereignty, the more you will go towards war. I would even go beyond Maritain, because Maritain said the term sovereignty can only be used for God and for the Pope. I mean, probably the Protestants among you would join me and said, well, it's also problematic to see the Pope as a sovereign. But if you believe in a Trinitarian God, even God is not sovereign in the way we human beings understand sovereignty. And one of the influential thinkers that influenced me, but also Girard, was the French mystic and philosopher Simone Weil, and she was very critical of Maritain on this part, because her understanding of God was not a sovereign God in the sense of the thing. So I stop here because
we'll talk more.
Yeah, there was a lady over there, and then Paul, please.
I was just going to talk very locally. In Chicago, the Institute for Nonviolence has wonderful training using the Kingian model of nonviolence, to your question there and everybody else. And I have been really impressed with the rapid response teams, response to ICE. We have been doing tons of nonviolent training to protect our people. The for Nonviolence has been around for years. I've done a number of their trainings. They're great, and I actually brought them into a rapid response team, and we're trying to work with
Thank you very much. Strengthening the fabric instead of the chessboard means to connect all those different initiatives and to make us strong in that case. And it just reminds me, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, for instance, in Austria, does a lot of Rosenberg trainings with local communities and groups. So there are things, and we should be aware of what's going on and share those information. Thank you very much. So Paul, and then the lady up there and the guy over here. Paul.
I'm wondering if a stronger idea of Ascension and Pentecost help with that sovereignty of God. I'm reading the texts these days differently under nationalism, and the Emmaus text was, we had hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And the oneness of that sovereignty is in question, I think, in that text, because they don't recognize Jesus, the one who redeemed them, and he keeps disappearing on them when they do recognize him, and then he ascends out of their sight and pours out the Spirit on all of them, especially the most vulnerable, the servants and and to me that this year that's a God of a different sovereignty, not the one, but heaven forbid, e pluribus unum, the one from many. God's sovereignty is being poured out on everything. Does that make some sense with?
Yeah, I mean, I've never reflected in that direction, but I said already the Trinity, and you by referring to a Pentecostal understanding or reframing of sovereignty and referring to the Holy Spirit, I think it's a very different concept than our normal human projections of a powerful king or about a sovereign decider is something.
Yeah, the ascension is about Jesus and God not wanting to be the one sovereign in the way that human beings are.
Yeah.
And that the Christian message ends up being about the Pentecost, the pouring out of God's Spirit on everyone.
Mm-hmm. I'll take that with me home to Austria and think about that further. I think it's interesting. It's a very good insight. Yeah.
I appreciated your distinction between the aggression or the violence of the aggressor and the violence of the defender. I'm wondering, do you have a succinct definition of violence as you're using the term?
That's a difficult question, but in 2018 I was for 6 months in Princeton in the Center of Theological Inquiry, and that was a seminar on religion and violence. My first rebuttal was, I'm only working on violence and religion, not the other way around, but that's another question. And the first task we were 8 scholars, very different backgrounds and different countries, to define religion and violence. Religion is even more complicated than violence, but in regard to violence, we have the Norwegian scholar Johan Galtung, who invented the concept of structural violence, and he developed then a triangular concept of violence. So you have open, visible violence, you have structural violence, meaning there is no war, there is no bloodshed, but you have racial discriminations or other types of discriminations. That's called structural violence. And the third concept is cultural violence. That's the type of thinking or concepts of discovery that legitimate cultural violence. So you have if you have a theology in your mind that white people are better than non-white people, then you have a justification for racial discrimination. So this triangle of violence that was developed by Johan Galtung is my working definition and helps to I mean, in another talk there is a very inspiring sermon, a very inspiring sermon of Martin Luther King, a sermon on an obnoxious peace, where I don't know if you have ever heard that, but you can find it in the internet, not his words, but his sermon as he wrote it in the archive. And he says, I mean, the story was in the University of Alabama, the first black woman was allowed to join the university, And then there was right-wing extremists, white people who made a lot of chaos and violence. And the black woman was again ousted of the university to protect her. And the local newspaper wrote on the next day, now there is peace again on the campus of the University of Alabama. And Martin Luther King then gave the sermon on an obnoxious piece where he talked in a like a litany. He says what kind of peace he doesn't like. If peace means to discriminate others, if peace means not to be concerned about social justice, I don't like this peace. This peace stinks in the nose of God. So if you have the concept of Galtung, that's positive peace compared to negative peace, and it's related to structural violence. I think that's a very helpful definition. And there is also, I mean, some people also say, but that's probably part of cultural violence, epistemological violence. That means how your thinking, how your mind is framed, already could cause legitimation of violence.
Could you spell Galtung?
Galtung.
G-A-L-T-U-N-G.
Okay.
Easier to write than to spell.
Johann.
He was the founder of modern peace studies, a Norwegian. He died, I think, 1.5 years ago, but he had a big influence on peace studies. And his famous book, I think, is also in English called Structural Violence, and you will find in the internet this triangle of violence with those 3 dimensions very well described. So, the guy here.
Really appreciated, especially the nuance with Gandhi, the realism of the gradient of nonviolence, right? I'm curious about the effective impact of sacrifice unto death, to resist violence without enacting violence to the point of death, and then that death's impact on the crowd would be a term for it, but both positively and negatively, I'm curious if you could speak to how the ethic of nonviolence or active nonviolence plays itself out in changing groupthink when it goes sideways.
Groupthink.
Yeah. When the end isn't what we'd hope.
Yeah. I mean, you also asked the question about sacrifice and nonviolence, right? So that was the first thing I reminded of some important insights. I mean, Gandhi once wrote a list of modern mortal sins, something like that. And one of those things is religion without sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
So from a Girardian perspective, you are a little bit worried about that. What does it mean? But if you investigate Gandhi deeper, Gandhi was very critical of terrorists. I mean, already at the time of Gandhi, there were suicide terrorists who killed themselves in order to kill English oppressors and so on. And Gandhi was very critical of that. So if you read him carefully, you see a clear distinction very close to the later Girard between sacrifice that should be criticized and is very dangerous, and then on the other hand, the willingness to risk your life if it's necessary. And the interesting thing about Gandhi is that he said, what is the most important precondition for a non-violent fighter? Like the soldier, he has to overcome his fear of death. So if we think about non-violent fighting is just pie in the sky and everything is fine and rosy and there is no risk, then there is a deep misunderstanding of that. But you don't seek sacrifice, because that's the danger, that you think that is so sacrifice might be necessary, but you don't seek it. And the second part of your question about group, change of group thinking, or?
Yeah, the impact of the sense I have is that the crowd becomes radicalized when somebody dies in the throes of active nonviolence. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to the dynamics of radicalizing towards active nonviolence and the stealing up of the group towards that ethic, and also the reacting against towards violence?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that Gandhi, like Girard, was very critical of crowds. And in the case of, Girard, you can explain it because he didn't like crowds at all. When I was there at Stanford in 1992, there was a big thing going on because Gorbachev, just after he was ousted, was a one-day law professor there and gave a speech in an open air arena. And there were thousands of people there, and I was very happy to be there. And Girard stayed at home because he doesn't like those things. In the case of Gandhi, it's a little bit more complicated because he was very critical of crowds, because he understood in some way the mimetic danger how crowds develop, and at the same time he created big crowds to fight for nonviolence. And the thing that strikes me most, because I studied Gandhi in 2021 in a research center in South Africa for 6 months, and Gandhi stayed in South Africa for 21 years. It's often overlooked because in the 3-hour Gandhi movie, the South African period is only 15 minutes, so it's a little bit, because active nonviolence was developed there. And one of the first things that started in Johannesburg, a campaign against the British people there, they made a vow individually. So I think a Muslim companion of Gandhi said, let's take a vow. And then they took really, and Gandhi said, okay, that's a good idea, because then every single person has to decide for himself, really he risk those things that are at stake, really go in that direction. So I think crowd dynamic very often, because of the mimetic nature, goes in the wrong direction. So you need a crowd with committed individuals. And there are some examples in Gandhi. And later on, when campaigns of Gandhi went in the wrong direction, he also cancelled them or stopped them and said, okay, we cannot go forward because that's going in the wrong direction. So out of insights of mimetic theory, we should be very skeptical of crowd dynamics, but that doesn't mean we can join together in a good fabric. But the good fabric should consist of individuals who have committed themselves as a person, not because of the contagious dynamic.
Good morning. I was born and raised in Argentina during the Dirty War, and now I work here in Chicago and in El Salvador. And as I was listening to you, I found myself thinking about Latin America's contribution to nonviolence, both in terms of practice and faith. And I thought of Romero, and I thought of even Pope Leo today. I wanted to kind of think in terms of what someone over there said, in terms of today Latino communities here in the United States carry many histories and memories of dictatorship, persecution, trauma, grief, longing, loss, and also truth-telling and reparations and reconciliation and living after, like phenomenology and meaning-making. And I thought about, my question to you is, what do you think the global conversation on nonviolence and perhaps American civic life, that social fabric, still has to learn from Latin America's experiences with memory, faith, reconciliation, and democratic imagination?
Yeah, thank you very much. So your question is about what, in regard to nonviolence and peace, we can learn from the experiences of people in Latin America. I mean, I'm not very good on Latin America because I have not been there for long enough, only short stops once in Colombia and once in Mexico City only. I'm immediately reminded of a Brazilian bishop, Dom Helder Camara, who was also a very important supporter of the idea of nonviolence early on in the Catholic Church. And because you referred to the two recent popes, I think Pope Francis was an Argentinian.
Well, I'm batting 2 for 2, you know. Pope Francis and Pope Leo. So.
Yeah, and Pope Leo is a U.S. citizen and also a Peruvian citizen. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I often also mention in my talks about peace is, and that's probably a European perspective or a Western perspective, after the war of aggression, the full-blown war of aggression against Ukraine started in 22, in Europe and partly in the Western world, the people were shocked. There was no war, and now is war, and why is war now? And Pope Francis, from his early pontificate onwards, so he became Pope in 2013, and in 2014 he was giving a speech in reminding memory of the outbreak of the First World War in an Italian cemetery in 2014. And he, for the first time, used the term, and then he used it throughout his papacy, that we are living in a Third World War fought piecemeal. So we're living already in a Third World War piecemeal, and he was referring to acts of terrorism, to daily violence in cities over the world, but also in the global south, in Latin America. And so I said, this perspective from the global south enabled Pope Francis to see a very different world from the Western world. So the Western world said, there was peace and now is war, and the Pope said, well, there's war going on all the time, so we should realize how violence is threatening people all over the world. And that was his insight from the global south, and Pope Leo repeated that term in his peace message of this year in January. He again talks about this Third World War piecemeal. So it's again epistemologically very important to open our eyes widely to see all forms of violence that's going on in our world, and don't blind us and probably think that Europeans or some Western people think they live in peace and there is no violence going on until 2022. So we have to learn a lot from that. There was also another Nobel Prize winner, peace from Latin America, Esquivel.
Costa Rica.
Yeah.
And then there's
So,
Rigoberta Menchia from Guatemala.
yeah. Also, so yeah, we can learn a lot, and I mean, I'm very happy I'm connected to Pax Christi International, and the General Secretary of Pax Christi International is a woman from Colombia, So we hear a lot from that perspective, also from initiatives how to overcome in those states with the history of terrorism and paramilitary fight against terrorism. So there is a lot to learn in regarding to peace and violence.
Thank you. Perhaps Latino storytelling is the loom in that
Yeah,
social
I mean,
fabric.
storytelling is very important because we need good stories, and we need also to see what at stake. Okay, I'm not in charge of your seminar, and we are already 17 minutes after 11. I mean, there's another.
We'll continue with questions.
I just want to
Yeah,
say
please.
that it's a pleasure to be here with you and everyone. I'm learning so much. As a child, I had this connection with the universe where I felt like if I prayed all the time, I could pray for the whole world to be in peace. All of the wars would end. And as I grew older, I just people talking about generational curses with the wars, and wars would never, there was always going to be a war or wars on the planet. And so was seeking and searching for what the truth. I went in that direction, seeking for truth in any situation. And so I guess what I'm just trying to say is that I always have hope. And I always pray for peace for around the world. And I always have thoughts of all the things that's going on, and to not get so indulged into like with the social media, with the news, and it puts fear into people. And so with all the practices, religious practices, with what is it? Not the generational curse, but the spiritual warfare. And that is why part of the countries, that's one of the reasons why the countries are fighting, because they all have their own beliefs of what they believe is right for them. And it can be dividing us by our skin color, by the color of our eyes, by education, where we live. And that's exactly what we're going through right now. And it always has been. But being as a child, I always thought that it could be fixed. And so being with others like myself, who try to make a difference in my own way, I do have to go within myself and recondition myself to fit in a better way where I'm understood and I understand others. And well, music is the outlet for me. Music brings people together no matter where they're from. Mm-hmm. And so that's the direction I go in with music, as an outlet for peace.
Yeah, maybe I'll take up what you said about music, and then also what you said about hope. So first, music. I think about 20 years ago, I was in Sarajevo, so still very close to the war that was going on there. And I met a Franciscan monk who was, with others, a co-founder of a multi-religious choir in Sarajevo. It's called Bond Anima, the bridge between souls. And you can see it on YouTube what they do. They sing Jewish, Christian, and Muslim songs together. And sorry?
Could you write it?
The choir is prompt anima. So you can find performances of them on YouTube, and that's a very encouraging example what in such a difficult situation as in Bosnia and Herzegovina, how music can go forward and help the people to come together without first talking about religious differences and concepts and so on. And the second thing, what struck me, what you said in the beginning, was about hope. Because when I wrote this book, the last chapter in the first edition, so that's now the second edition with about 30 pages where I talk about multilateralism, but the original version ended with a chapter on hope. And when I wrote it in 2023, I was already, there are a lot of reasons to be in despair. And I thought, how can we have still hope? And what does it mean in times of war to be hopeful? And I was thinking about, there is a type of hope that is very dangerous, that means this kind of progressivism, everything will turn out fine. This hope does not help us at all, because it will lead to passivity. We do nothing because everything will be good in the end anyway. And so that's dangerous. To lose hope results in the same inaction, and again it's very dangerous. So I came across Gandhi's insight. Gandhi, you know, in his evening prayers in his communities, he draw on Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim songs and poems and texts. And one of the things that was that he held very dear was a hymn by John Henry Newman, and even the early Protestant John Henry Newman, when he was for a couple of months in Italy and was very sick and in despair, he wrote this hymn, "Lead Kindly Light." And Gandhi liked this hymn very much, because in the end, so it's about darkness, about despair and so on, but there is a kindly light who gives us a little bit of hope. And then it says in the end of the first part of this hymn that we do not seek to know how the future looks like, because very often among peace movement people, they want to have the blueprint, how will the world completely be fine and peaceful in 20 years, and as soon as we have this blueprint, then we will be active. And as long as we don't have the full plan, we don't do anything. And this results in not doing anything. And so this hymn says, we don't want to know how the future looks like. The next step is enough. The next step is enough. And that was what Gandhi thought is so important. We always have a little bit of light to just see what is the next step I can do today and tomorrow, without strengthening multilateralism in the way I would like to have it. But that is a long-term project. But I can, in my own life or in my responsibility, in profession or whatever, in my social civil life, I see possible next steps. And those steps have to be taken, are very important. They don't give a full solution immediately, but only if we do those next steps, we will go in the right direction. So this is a kind of hope without not looking into the darkness that is still there.
May I say something? Just on hope, when we say hopefully this will happen, but if you play with that word, hopefully, hopefully, and that holds all of this intention for those next steps, to hopefully. fully.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a good insight.
It's not mine.
Yeah.
I give credit to Eugene Williams in the
Yeah.
United Methodist Church of the Northern Illinois
Yeah.
Conference.
So 99% what I said today is also not mine, but.
I have a question about the catechon, and I want to ask this on a register that's on the micro register of family life. I work as a psychotherapist, often with parents, with especially well-educated, progressive parents. They're very uncomfortable exercising legitimate parental authority in the family, and often I'm encouraging people. So a parent will say to me, for example, I don't want to send my child, even a very young child, to church because I don't want to impose my worldview on them. And to say instead, your child needs your guidance, formation, but also in Girardian terms, we could say kind of a restraint from unrestrained mimetic conflict that can erupt among kids in the family.
Yeah.
So is this something, you learn something about the catechon that can be relevant for family life?
I'm not sure, but I would have to think about if the catechon, if this term would apply to family life. But I can understand your question in that sense, and I was just last week in Rome and met there the former president of Ireland, who was president for 12 years, and engaged Catholic, very critical woman. And she's a lawyer, but also studied later canon law, and she's against child baptism or what is it called? Infant baptism, because she thinks that's against human rights. And I don't agree with her for the very reason that children have a right to be raised in a worldview, and I think we should do that. And but allow the children, if they are grown-ups or if they are adults, to live the worldview we introduced them, because that means there is this need of freedom of conscience, but not with the very small children. So if we don't educate them at all and leave them for 18 years in a void, I think that's inhumane. And I have I don't know if it's convincing, but I have a strange analogy. If you raise children, and my wife and I, we have 3 of them, and now 3 grandchildren, you force them to brush their teeth. And you can say, well, this is against their freedom, so let them grow up until they're 18 and their teeth are rotten, and then they can decide. So therefore, I think maybe the analogy is not very good, but I think it's better to grow up in a sustainable, clear worldview than to leave them with nothing. I mean, still one can discuss if baptism has that to be a kind of formal rite or whatever, but I would rather say let's do that, but give them also the freedom if they later on decide to go in a different direction, we should let them go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Close to the end, for the end of the second most of you know me, know that I'm very interested in music, and this goes way back to the beginning of your talk, when you discussed the question of Jesus standing on dignity. Quoted that in John's Gospel, the Passion narrative, Jesus is struck, and then Jesus says, "Why, if I spoke to evil, why do you strike me?" And since I'm very devoted to J.S. Bach, I immediately think of that amazing moment, the St. John Passion, where he's sitting there. And you're clarifying how Bach perfectly, powerfully captures the sense of Jesus, though vulnerable, stands on the dignity in a very powerful way. And with the music work behind the scenes is sort of slightly good. And the rest of the team, it's kind of speaking through music. Warum schreist du mich? Yeah, there's the way that the musical line works, and his exclamation point. And it just sort of knocks you over, and it just such a powerful embodiment of the kind of force that Jesus is using even in a vulnerable situation.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I was not aware of that, although I listened already several times to Bach's Passion of John, but I will do it again, and it means that Bach understood that he is really insisting and fighting against his dignity taken away. When I think about Bach, I'm always thinking about the Passion of Matthew and the despair and the crying of St. Peter. So that's the passage that is so moving. But it just shows that Bach understood a lot what we can. So thank you very much. Yeah. So I will listen to that very soon. And next time I will tell that story as if I invented it myself. Yeah. Paul,
and maybe just the question about catechone and family. Have you ever thought about the relationship between catechone and pedagogue in Galatians 3? How do you think those might be related? I mean, pedagogue seems a little bit more relevant to family life, but are those two kind of related in Paul's thought?
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I'm not sure now about Galatians 3, what it's really there, so I'm not know the New Testament by heart. But I think there is this guardian, the guardian, yeah. And I think Hamilton Kelly wrote about that, and when I read it in Hamilton Kelly's book, I thought about that's also related to the catechone. And then we should not forget Romans 13, which plays a big role in the history of church peace ethics, also going in the wrong direction partly. Romans 13 is also related to the catechone in some way. Okay, the lady there. Yeah, I didn't see you. You were not here before, right?
No, I
Yeah. No, it's yeah.
It's good to see you. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. So I have a couple of questions. That you use the term long term in terms of disrupting violence, disrupting imitative violence, and in your own work, I wonder, could you speak to how the levels set the minds of peace builders? Because, as you said earlier, peace builders want to see something immediately, and you consistently use the word long term as you work out what it means to move in nonviolence, even with the models of Gandhi and Mandela, and looking at Simone Weil. What have those readings, and what do you understand about the long-term gain, if you will, of moving in nonviolence to create peace?
I was not aware that I used the term so often, but maybe you made me aware now. I really think that peace work and engagement in peace is a long-term project, and you yourself, I myself, have to develop and rethink and start. So when I today am rather critical of absolute pacifists, then I'm also criticizing what I thought 20 years ago in some way, because 20 years ago I was a little bit too much in a romantic understanding of peace. So I think developing as a peacemaker, as an artisan of peace, is a long-time project, and not only a long-time project, it's a lifelong project. So I'm not finished with my own temptations towards violence, and it comes back again and again, and you have to move forward. So like life forces us to work on our character and our virtues. This work means the same.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the conversation about the family in just a minute here. But in terms of the question of long-term peace, Kant's essay on perpetual peace, talks about 3 different paths. And I think it's helpful at recognizing how structurally there are manifestations of peace all around us when we have eyes to see. So that's my first recommendation. Take a look at the 3 different paths that Kant sketches out to a perpetual peace. One of them is trade. And the book I'm working on right now, one of them is entitled Peace Growing. Because I think peace, we talk about it in terms of building often. And I think that's not the best metaphor. Because I think peace is more like gardening, planting, agriculture. I mean, it's cultivating more than it's hammering and it's nailing, etc. Thirdly, back to the question of the family. It seems to me the situation we're facing right now is that there's a fetishization of the hetero monogamous family unit and a scapegoating of LGBTQ individuals and groups. So to invoke the family as a catechon, in fact, we might be facing a situation where the family is functioning more like Antichrist when it is fetishized in that particular way that then defines itself over and against these other vulnerable individuals and groups. I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, I would agree. Actually, for another project, I was just reading J.D. Vane's spiritual biography.
Bless you.
Yeah, I finished it yesterday, the reading. And there are passages in it when he talks about the most important thing is to raise your children as virtuous people. Yeah. I agree. Mm-hmm. But when you see at the same time how often it is put against the secular world or other world, so I think families are important, but we should not emphasize the importance of families in a black and white framework against others, and therefore we have to broaden that. So I think I agree, and that was. It's a little bit difficult to criticize this book. You have to think a little bit. But one of the problems is that most of the things that I would agree with are in a framework against something, and I don't understand the necessity to put those things that are important against something.
He's in the midst of it. He has little choice politically.
Yeah, I understand that too.
Yeah.
Okay, Daniel.
Thank you.
I was struck by the comment of your own process, and I was wondering what your insights around discernment are. How do you parse over time kind of what this, particularly when you're talking about nonviolence being on a scale? And it seems to me that's really the art of any given moment to determine, is it incremental progress and kind of cultivating a garden? Are there kind of rules or processes that you follow in terms of making that discernment?
Yeah, it's difficult to reflect on your own process in that sense. I mean, I'm engaged in the Catholic Nonviolence initiative that created 2 years ago the Catholic Institute of Nonviolence in Rome. And when I'm talking with those people there, and we will have meeting in September in Rome again, I always have the feeling they are still propagating, advocating absolute nonviolence. And as a peace ethicist, I myself said, well, I mean, if I would just say absolute nonviolence, nothing else, a politician cannot listen to me because I cannot help him. So I have to see both. And so therefore, in order to be able to contribute to the political and social questions at stake, I have to broaden my thing, and then I felt it's not just that I'm an advocate of absolute peace and nonviolence and forget the work outside. It would be hypocritical. So therefore, but I cannot tell you. I mean, probably from a Marxist point of view, say, well, he is grown old and is now also liking the benefits of bourgeoisie, and therefore it's opening up. I hope that's not the case, but it's difficult to judge yourself. I mean, I just try to see the whole problem and yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
So in that, seeing the whole problem, do you look for, or what I'm looking for is kind of, how do you make judgments in the world of public policy, where I deal a lot with?
Yeah.
Is it kind of this notion of constant incremental progress tends to win at the day as opposed to broad strokes, which can feel very morally gratifying and very elusive?
Yeah.
So is it, that's kind of where I'm,
yeah.
Is that kind of the...
I mean, I think that's going in the right direction. I mean, so there is a debate in peace ethics about the value of just war theory. And after the war of aggression against Ukraine, some scholars said, yeah, we have to go back to the just war theory. The non-violent people said, no, that's over, and just war theory is completely wrong. And I think, and I said that already, I find this position of Pope Francis very helpful when he says non-violence is a necessary complement of the criteria to limit war. And we had a little bit of a discussion. I mean, if you take the new encyclical by Pope Leo, it's not only an encyclical about AI. So it's the first parts are giving you an overview of Catholic social teaching in a very broad and very helpful way. Then you have the application to AI, but then you have also a full chapter on geopolitics and peace ethics. And it's, as I said, it's very strong in favor of multilateralism. It's very critical of this normalization of war. And so the astonishing thing, and that was our discussion in the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, the term nonviolence is not used once in the book. I think the term peace comes up 99 or 97 times, the term nonviolence not. So some of my colleagues could not explain that. But I think as a pope, you want to contribute, and you have to contribute to the political debate. So so the pope was very courageous to criticize the act of aggression against Venezuela and Iran very clearly, and by using the criteria of the just war tradition. So just to say, Mr. President, you are not non-violent. I mean, the president would just laugh and said, I mean, are you completely nuts? So he doesn't say that. So he really says just war theory is outdated, and there are a lot of other means. So you have to you have to find a language and a framework that forces the politicians to listen, and we saw that they listened because they immediately jumped into the discussion and discussed with him, and so therefore I think you have to be very smart in some way, or clever as serpents to address those things. And I was parts of the encyclical, and I'm not now bragging. I could have written them because it's so close to my heart. So there is an ongoing development in peace ethics that's going in a very good direction. But by not using the term nonviolence, the Pope avoided, or those who wrote the encyclical and so on, or are in nature responsible, but of course the final word was his, was let's not be too immediately pushed off the table. Because if you present yourself as an absolute pacifist, you are for good reasons pushed from the table immediately because you cannot contribute to the problem. And nevertheless, he challenges those things. And
I think that's really helpful. Sorry to jump in again. David Courtwright, in his book Peace, A History of Movements and Ideas, proposes what he calls a realistic pacifism, which I think is an interesting conjunction of terms. And then the real criteria for breaking with absolute pacifism is the responsibility to protect the vulnerable, right? I mean, that's when violence is warranted against violence in his particular description. And the current situations that would warrant that, or most of all, would be, of course, Ukraine, but then we also have Gaza and the West Bank, where you have vulnerable people, right? I won't go any further with that. I realize it's very difficult right now, but certainly U.S. policy has been completely contrary to the responsibility to protect.
I agree, but because I was in a special investigation room yesterday by entering the United States.
Were you?
Oh, God, I'm sorry. Be very careful. Be very careful. I mean, the main reason is I was in 2015 in Iran, and that's a problem.
Yep.
Yeah, but
good God.
I mean, I fully agree, and it's helpful to have a special type of terms that we use. And I said Olaf Müller, this German philosopher who is one of the outspoken people for a good peace ethics, he talks about pragmatic pacifism or about enlightened pacifism. So in that sense, you need a qualifier so that people understand what are you in favor of. I, for instance, don't use the term pacifism. So I don't call me pacifist because, and it's interesting, at least in the Catholic peace ethics in the United States, there are a lot of people who don't use the term pacifist. So I'm a quite admirer of the new Archbishop of Washington, Robert McElroy. He avoids the term pacifism, but he very strongly favors that nonviolence is now at the center of peace ethics, and we have to overcome the just war tradition very close to the Pope, and also we have to change some things in the catechism and so on. But he avoids the term pacifism because pacifism is, and also Walter Wink was critical of that term, because it's very often misunderstood in a passive way. And sometimes, and I mentioned it today, when the first book was published to introduce Gandhi's ideas to the Western world, to the United States, by, I think, Robert Gregg, Gandhi was asked to write a preface, and he wrote a preface, and he said in his preface, the term pacifism, the Western term of pacifism, is not the proper translation of my term satyagraha.
Satyagraha,
So
yeah.
that's also why we have to be careful. So if we use the term, you have to qualify it, so because otherwise you are immediately misunderstood and you are immediately pushed ethically and politically as irrelevant, and we have to avoid that if we want to move forward in regard to peace.
Thank you. I would like to get you out of the hot seat, but thank you so much. This is just